This is the video on classical rhetoric and technical communication. So what is rhetoric? How might we define it? Here's a definition from dictionary.com, and the way we're thinking about rhetoric is a little further down on the list. Down we get to at least number 3, the study of the effective use of language. When we get to 6, the art of making persuasive speeches, that's closer to what we're trying to do, because for us, rhetoric is synonymous with persuasion. And of course, number 7 is the classical oratory. And that's closer to how we're thinking about rhetoric, though rather than in a persuasive speech, we're thinking about it as persuasive writing. So one of the most complete works that we have on rhetoric is from Aristotle, and he lived from 384 to 322 BCE. His father was a court physician, but he died when Aristotle was fairly young, and the Macedonians were actually this was the people that would eventually produce Alexander the Great. We'll talk more about in a few minutes. And so, since his father died when he was pretty young, he was sent to Athens to be a student in Plato's academy. He was there for 20 years. After Plato died, what the histories record is that, of course, Aristotle could not have expected to then become head of Plato's academy, even though he was Plato's star student. But he did leave at that time and became part of what are called the peripatetic philosophers. And what they would literally do is they would meet outdoors and they would walk from one place to another, and that's how they had their classes. So Aristotle's teacher was Plato, and supposedly if Aristotle was late getting to class, Plato would not start class until Aristotle arrived. And when Aristotle did arrive, he would say, the mind is here. And so far as we know, he didn't say that sarcastically. And Plato's teacher, of course, was Socrates. And in terms of whom was Aristotle's student, classical literature tells us that it was Alexander the Great, but there's actually no mention of that until several hundred years after both had been dead. So it's kind of questionable. There's not any real evidence that Aristotle ever taught Alexander the Great. Aristotle's notion of government, which we'll talk more about in a minute, which is by the one, the few, and the many, is what our government is modeled on here in the United States. We have the president, and then the few is the Senate, and then the many is the House of Representatives. Of course, the House of Representatives, a state with a greater population has more state representatives than a state that has fewer, or has less population. So, and Alexander was a dictator. He was a military dictator. The only way in which he was like Aristotle is that Aristotle was interested in everything, and so was Alexander, from what's been written about him. Okay, so this is Aristotle's actual definition from his work, The Rhetoric, and it's the earliest body of work on rhetoric. That is, and they were thinking about it as persuasive speaking, and it was their bread and butter class. Aristotle would teach rhetoric classes in the morning when he was at Plato's academy, and then in the afternoon he would teach on whatever else he was interested in. About a third of his work was on life sciences. So that's actually what people started out studying. Charles Darwin, for example, studied Aristotle's work on life sciences when he before he dropped out of medical school, um, because it just wasn't what he was interested in. And at that time, biology was not a subject that was taught in school. You might get some of it from what Aristotle had written, but if you didn't happen to study that, then you wouldn't. Um, but anyway, this is his definition of rhetoric: the ability in all situations to see the available means of persuasion in each case. These are also rhetorical situations or places where rhetoric is appropriate that Aristotle defined: the judicial, which of course is the courts, the deliberative, which is sometimes called the legislative, and calling it the legislative makes it clearer what Aristotle was thinking about. He was thinking about in the in like in legislatures where laws are written. And then the epidictic can be used for praise, or it could be used for blame, and so we can see how those would work in with the uh, the legislative, especially in terms of people being elected to office. And this is not from the from Aristotle's Rhetoric. It's from a work called the Rhetorica ad Herennium, which is actually the longest work on rhetoric that we have from the ancient world, but it's from the ancient Romans. It's believed that Cicero wrote it, that it was like his notes when he was studying, that he created when he was studying in law school, but it's not signed as anonymous, and it's been gone back and forth over the years as to who actually wrote the Rhetorica ad Herennium. But uh, I think right now they're saying that it's believed that Cicero wrote it. Okay, we also have the rhetorical appeals, which we are taken from Aristotle's Rhetoric, Ethos, Pathos, and Logos. We've talked a little bit about this semester. For two of them, you can kind of go by what they look like. Logos looks like logic, and it is logic. A uh, a written work and or speech can appeal to us through logic. And then pathos looks like sympathy or empathy, and that's the emotional appeal. But the problem you get into with uh, what words look like in terms of what they might mean is with ethos. A lot of times people will think ethos looks like ethics, and they use the same root. But ethos has to do with the character of the speaker, how the character uh, presents himself or herself, their credentials, and so forth. And an example I've used on the first day of class, I showed up wearing torn overalls and no shirt. You might have questioned my ability to teach you um, a class in writing, um, but be that as it may. It is how the speaker presents herself or himself, and that is from the rhetoric. Okay, reasoning bears a little bit more discussion. There are there are two different ways of breaking it down. One is the syllogism, and the other is the enthymeme. We're going to talk a little bit about each now. Now, the classical syllogism, you may have also run into that, but let's say that we're developing an argument. Our first premise is that Socrates is a man. Okay, so we can tell by observation that Socrates is a man. And we know that all men are mortal. That's also a fact that's indisputable. That's how uh, this type of reasoning works best with facts that are indisputable. Therefore, we can assume that Socrates is mortal. Okay, so how could this be expressed as an enthemy? Well, we would simply say that of course, Socrates is mortal. We wouldn't go through and say, well, Socrates is men, all men are mortal. We just, Socrates is mortal. That's an example of an enthemy. Or another way of looking at it is it's been called a truncated syllogism. What truncated means is that some of its parts are missing, like one or more of the premises are missing. Sometimes it can be cultural. This is something that, like we have certain assumptions that we make about different rights that we have that people in other countries don't have. Um, like for example, in Germany and in France, the Nazi Party is illegal, and here in the United States, there are groups like that, but we don't make them illegal. But of course, in both Germany and France, France suffered quite a bit at the hands of the Nazis, and so the German people felt they had as well. Um, but here in the United States, we don't do that. We don't make political parties illegal. Let's say, another example of an enthemy would be, let's say that a political or religious group you abhor sets up a table on your campus and hands out pamphlets. Nobody seems surprised or particularly concerned. Well, let's say that you see this and you get back to your wherever you live and you're telling your roommate or your family or whatever um, just how horrified you were that this group was there, and your roommate or your whoever you're talking to just sighs and says, "Well, it's First Amendment. The First Amendment gives us right to freedom of speech, right? And it's something that we accept that even though we don't agree with all the different points of views that are expressed in the United States, that at least we have the ability to express them." And when we say something like that, oh, it's First Amendment, we're not going to completely unpack it and say, well, there's the United States Constitution. That's a fact, something that we all know, and that it was amended with the Bill of Rights, and the First Amendment says, and then we could quote that exactly. But we don't do all that. We just say, oh, it's First Amendment. So that's an example of an enthymeme. Are there other types of rhetorical appeals? We'll give that some thought, and I have an exercise that we can look at later. In terms of logic, there are different types of reasoning. Deductive reasoning is an example of that is the classical syllogism, where you're reasoning from what are referred to as universal truths. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. We know these from observation, countless observation. We know them to be universal truths. Inductive reasoning is different, and it's the reasoning of science. For example, you've all heard of Louis Pasteur, or you've at least heard of pasteurized milk, and that's the heating of milk to a certain temperature so that it kills the bacteria that's in it before it's put into bottles and sent out to into stores. Pasteur also did this. He had a lot to do with improving the likelihood that a woman would survive childbirth. Um, so yeah, he had observed germs and theorized a role in causing diseases, and further observation upheld these conclusions. And something else, at the beginning of the 20th century, um, the average lifespan of a woman was in her like late 20s, And the reason that this was so is that, for one thing, women married earlier, and they also tried to, after they were married, they would try to start families, and it was much more likely that a woman would die during childbirth. So that still happens occasionally, but not nearly as often as it used to. And in this case, it was just uh, when Pasteur recommended that doctors and midwives should wash their hands before trying to help a woman to give birth, be involved in that process. So, okay, so this is inductive reasoning. It's different from deductive. You're reasoning from the particular to the general. That is, looking at theorizing about these germs and their role in disease, and making a general application based upon those observations. So anyway, they both work in terms of the type of reasoning that we do with writing persuasive documents. Another concept from rhetorical theory is the rhetorical canon. And this is something that Cicero came up with. So far as we know, he didn't copy it directly from Aristotle, but on the other hand, we don't have Aristotle's entire rhetoric. And there's controversy about that, if Aristotle even wrote any of his works, or if they were just his notes that his students made from his lectures. But anyway, we don't, with Aristotle's rhetoric, for example, there's no conclusion. So that's problematic. But the rhetorical canon has these elements. This is something that Cicero did write up and did take credit for. One is invention, and this is an important part of the writing process. Invention is what we now call pre-writing strategies. Another is arrangement, and of course, the way in which you arrange the elements of a piece of writing make it. You could, if you arrange it one way, it's comparison contrast essay. If you arrange it another way, it's an argument, or you might use comparison and contrast to structure an argument. So, the other is style, which can vary from the use of the words that you make use of, which could be jargon terms or not. Or style can also refer to metaphor or analogy. And then with delivery, the ancient Romans were thinking about how a speech would actually be done, how it would be performed, what gestures you would use, and things like that. Today we tend to think more about how we're going to deliver it. Is it going to be a video? Is it going to be a pamphlet? Is it going to be an animation? Another is memory, and the ancient Greeks were thinking, and Romans were thinking about actual memorization. Today we think, in terms of memory, we think about how memorable something will be, something that has been a piece of writing that has been crafted in such a way that people will remember is more effective than one that does not make that particular grade. So. These are from Cicero's De Inventione. That is from one of his works that he did claim. So in terms of classical argument, this is how we apply that to um, your recommendation memo. Of course, you want to have an introduction. In the introduction, there needs to be a thesis. I would say that in terms of what you write, it's important to get to the point as quickly as possible, in the first sentence, preferably. And then the next thing you do is you provide any background that you think the reader may need. This can take the shape of a history. Like if you're writing about a problem in the workplace, how long has this been going on? What type of effect is it having on production and the ability of people to get their job done, that sort of thing. Or it could be definitions. So any terms that you think the reader needs to know um, in order to make sense of your document. And it's a mistake to think that if you send a document to someone in the workplace that they will be the only one who reads it. Everything that you write in the workplace is not owned by you. It's owned by the company that you work for. And so they can take it and they can do whatever they want to with it, send it to other people. So it needs to be, it's important that it's clear to all the audiences that it could conceivably come in contact with. Like, for example, if it's going to involve an expenditure, it needs to be clear to accountants. If it's something that has to be marketed, it needs to be clear to the sales force, and so forth. Now, after that, you get into the actual argument. What works best in terms of induction and deduction is to have a deductive framework. Um, but it is also inductive in the sense that we provide detailed examples. And where you find these detailed examples is often by going to the peer-reviewed articles, which are ones you get through the library. A general reader magazine or something like that, or especially a website, might make reference to a study. According to uh, Smith and Jones, uh, they concluded, whatever it was they concluded. What's more effective is to find that original article, that original study, and find out how they did their study um, and what conclusions that they drew from it. So you need to do your own take on any time that you run into a reference to another study. You need to find it and read it yourself and see what you can take from it. After you presented the argument, you then had the refutation. That's where you consider the opposing point of view and try to show how the opposing point of view is illogical or immoral or what have you, um, based on a fallacy and reason. That could be another good one. And then you move to your conclusion. And in the conclusion, you do a couple of things. One, you offer some summary, like you've been told going way back down in the grades. Then in the conclusion, you summarize. But I think you also do in this type of writing that you're doing a recommendation memo, you also make a recommendation. And so, based upon, and you see how this fits in with the idea of logic, based upon the evidence that you've presented in this memo, you make a recommendation for what you think the company should do. And it's important to have all your facts there, especially if you're asking somebody to spend money, which can be literally spending money or simply changing the way something is done, which can call for retraining or what have you, which is also expensive. Questions?